Hi there, folks. Brandon Triance-Haldane here, Senior Solution Engineer with Security Compass. Thanks for joining us for today's SD Elements demo session. It's the first one of the day. And what I thought I would do was start out by showing a few slides just to set up the problem that we're going to be talking about, and then I'll go into the software and we'll actually walk through a workflow. So let me go ahead and just quickly share my screen here. It should be this one, I believe. Looks good. And so, as I mentioned, I will be talking about SD Elements today as part of a proactive approach to security and compliance in DevOps. So I wanted to start with a quick statement here. It says, security and risk experts are focused on making the software secure and resilient while development teams struggle to deliver on time. In my experience, there is sometimes a correlation between these two things. As security people, we tend to be maybe a little more paranoid, a little more concerned about what vulnerabilities may end up in production. And that has historically presented some friction with business stakeholders and development stakeholders who really just want to get the latest and greatest features and functionality out to market. They want to be ahead of their competitors, and they want to make sure that they've got that competitive advantage. Often security, compliance, risk, privacy, these functions are seen as somewhat of a hindrance to getting to market quickly. And so we are going to talk a little bit about why that is and how SD Elements can help. I tend to think of security processes as falling into two camps. We've got reactive processes like code scans, pen tests, peer code review, bug bounties, these types of things. But there are also proactive things that should be happening, such as threat modeling, risk assessment, training, and so forth. And so, what we tend to find is that a lot of organizations that are trying to move quickly will focus more on those reactive processes. What we need to do is make the proactive processes faster, more scalable, and SD Elements is here to help with that. So if we think about some of these proactive processes, I've got 4 listed down the left-hand side: threat modeling, risk assessment, secure coding, privacy by design. You could sort of break any of these into the following 4 steps. If you're working with practitioners or so forth, you're going to start with an information gathering process where you try to understand what the asset is in question, what's being built, and then once that information has been gathered, you can start to assess that. So you may have a really experienced expert who's going to take a look at the information that's been gathered and try to determine what could go wrong. From that point, once we've determined what could go wrong, we need to start thinking about what are the recommendations. If it's threat modeling, what are the recommendations we want developers to implement to avoid these threats becoming vulnerabilities? If it's risk assessment, we may make some recommendations to try and lower the amount of inherent or whatever type of risk in the asset. And then once those recommendations have been made and ideally implemented, the final step is to try and validate what's been done and report on that as well. So again, as I say, most of these proactive processes could follow a very similar workflow here. We start by understanding the characteristics of what's being built, understanding what could go wrong, figuring out what we need to do to avoid having those things go wrong, and then finally assessing whether we did it correctly, and of course, being able to report. The challenge with doing this in the traditional way that organizations have tried to, using human practitioners and so forth, is that the processes tend to be very manual, very slow, expensive, inconsistent from one practitioner to the next, and of course siloed. So the risk team doesn't necessarily know what was discovered by the threat modeling team. Secure requirements are not necessarily able to be tied directly to the outcomes of threat models, and so on. So this creates a manual process, forms bottlenecks, and what we want to do with SD Elements is overcome these. So let's talk very quickly about what we can do to automate key parts of these proactive processes. Once I've gone over this slide, I'll share my browser and we'll get into the actual software demonstration. So you can see those same 4 steps: information gathering, expert assessment, recommendations, validation, and reporting. These are the steps that I'll touch on as we go through the demonstration. You see in the information gathering step, this is related to the SD Elements profiler. So we'll select a profile and use a survey to understand the characteristics of the asset under development. And those characteristics, once we've gathered those in the survey, those will then inform the decision engine in SD Elements. So So the knowledge base that comes with SD Elements contains a number of potential problems or weaknesses. It also contains definitions for a number of tasks or countermeasures that would serve to mitigate the problems that have also been identified. So in this expert assessment step, SD Elements is going to use rules and logic to determine which problems and tasks are relevant to the project based on the information we gathered with the profiler in the previous step. Of course, tasks, as I mentioned, are countermeasures. They're things that we may want developers or IT professionals to implement, and thus we want to make those recommendations to those teams in the tooling that they're already using. So today I'll reference Jira, but we do integrate with a number of other issue trackers where teams can pick up that work and integrate it into their sprints in a relatively seamless fashion. Last but not least, as the developers complete their work in the issue tracker, that completion status is synchronized back to SD Elements. So we're now in a position where we want to be able to validate that that work was done correctly. And we'll talk a little bit about integrating with static and dynamic analysis tools to help with that. And of course, we want to be able to run some reports as well, either for internal audit, external folks, just general due diligence and so forth. And so these are kind of the 4 steps that I'll walk through in the software demo. So with that being said, let me get this out of the way. And I think I have to stop sharing and reshare. And so I will just select the appropriate window here, and that at least appears to me like I've shared the right thing. Just before I get into the demonstration, my understanding is that any Q&A is best directed to our virtual booth. So if you do want to see a more in-depth demonstration, or if you have any questions, please feel free to hit up the virtual booth, speak to some folks there, and they should be able to put you in touch with a more complete full-scale demo. Where we start in the SD Elements workflow, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is with the information gathering step. Now, there are basically 2 ways that information can be gathered, either by a human pointing and clicking in the user interface, or of course there is also a REST API that underlies SD Elements, allowing us to pull data from various sources. You can write scripts and things like this to pull data from different sources, and then use the SD Elements API to select a profile, to answer survey questions. So you'll see the human point and click version of the demo today, but do keep in mind that we're talking about automation and efficiency, and so that is available as well via the API. So you could think of profiles in SD Elements as representing templates in a way. By selecting one of these profiles or one of these templates, we're going to apply a set of answers to the project survey in the next step. And I should mention that typically the users of SD Elements, especially in more mature organizations, tend to be security champions on development teams. So if we want to achieve scale across dozens or hundreds or thousands of development developers or development teams, projects, et cetera, we need to be able to do we need to be able to leverage that broader population. We can't have a small security population trying to effectively, gatekeep the development organization. That just falls back into the old trope of security being a blocker. We want security here to be an enabler. So by selecting a profile, you can see here that I've previously selected the Java Enterprise profile. What this does is applies a subset of answers relevant to Java Enterprise Edition to our project survey. So I'm just going to navigate to my next tab here, and we'll get a look at the actual survey itself. Now, one thing to mention about the survey, of course, and the profiles is that they are configurable. So if you want to create your own profiles, if you're consistently developing according to a particular tech stack, if you have either business-specific or domain-specific questions and answers that you want to ask in the project survey, that can all be done. Through the user interface. It's possible to add your own questions and answers and really tailor the survey according to your needs. We do try to provide a broad set of questions and answers by default, and I'll just go through those really quickly here now. The first 4 tabs deal primarily with the technologies that we're using in building this asset. So that may be programming languages and frameworks. It could be database components, web servers, et cetera. Really trying to give the platform a good idea of the different technologies that are going into whatever is being built, as that information will help the system determine what threats may occur given those technology choices. However, we talked earlier about these proactive processes, and it would be great if we could try and converge those to some extent and actually put them into the same consistent workflow. So you'll notice here that we do also ask about compliance in the SD Elements survey. So I've identified here that I'm building an asset that is bound for the European Union and the USA and Canada. I have also here under privacy indicated that this asset is going to handle personal data. The reason that I've done that is because it allows me to select different privacy laws, PIPEDA for Canada, GDPR for Europe, and of course CCPA as an example here as well for California. We want our developers and our IT professionals to be able to build things that are not only secure, but also meet compliance needs. What we don't want is to get to the end of a development iteration and basically have auditors send us back to do some rework because we've missed some important component of compliance. So we talk about technologies up top, we talk about compliance requirements, and then in the final couple of sections of the survey, what we're talking about here are the existing development environment and the deployment environment. So if you're doing static and dynamic code analysis today, these can be really useful results to bring back into SD Elements to try and verify for us whether the proactive measures, the tasks that we recommend to our developers, have actually been implemented correctly and comprehensively and so on. This is also going to help us identify potential gaps in your automated scanning so that you can focus your human efforts in a more efficient, more intelligent way. And for those human efforts, of course, SD Elements contains a number of testing tasks, and this section of the survey helps us scope those testing tasks so that, again, we can almost democratize the security of our products. If you heard the keynote this morning, Matthew from Honeywell talked a lot about culture and people, and so we could perhaps get QA folks, traditional QA folks, to take on some of the security testing for us, bringing in security SMEs and experts on an as-needed basis. And last but not least in the survey, of course, we do now cover deployment as well as the core application. So, if you're deploying using services from one of the common cloud providers, containerization and so on, this stuff is here as well. So moving right along from information gathering, the next step is a piece of expert assessment. So let me move on to my next tab, and we can see that based on those survey criteria, SD Elements has badged my project as critical. So this is important for a couple of reasons. There are two types of classification that we can do. Basic classification, which looks at single survey answers, and that's what I've done here. There's also a more sophisticated advanced classification that allows you to weight different survey answers and use mathematical equations to determine the criticality of an asset. For today, I've just kept it simple and used basic. The point here is that using something like SD Elements, we're doing rules-based classification. So given the same set of inputs, we will get the same output. So when we think back to that slide that talked about inconsistency, using the logic in SD Elements is a way to overcome that inconsistency. The other thing that is important here about assessing criticality is that the old method of development, being asked to do all the security things before we can deploy, that just doesn't work. That's where this idea of friction between security and development comes from. So what I would advocate is to take a risk-based approach to the security and compliance measures that you ask development teams to take. Try to balance these security, compliance, privacy, et cetera, balance these types of requirements with the functional stuff, with the features that actually go out to market and make your customers happy. So by badging this according to critical and by basing this critical classification on the presence of personal data, I'm able now to identify a couple of relevant policies that can help me do some filtering. So in this case, I have selected policies related to CCPA. Here's one that merges GDPR and CCPA, and here's another one that focuses just on GDPR. So the idea is that we can use this risk policy to highlight the highest value work, focus our developers' attention on it, and ideally also provide a threshold or a security bar. Another thing that Matthew from Honeywell spoke about this morning, we can actually set a security bar for this project based on its criticality so that we're asking our developers to do work that is relevant and meaningful in this context, as opposed to simply saying, go secure everything before we're going to be able to deploy. So for today's example, I'll select the GDPR plus CCPA policy. And actually what I'll do is then kind of navigate on to my next tab here. You can imagine that I'm continuing on past this screen. And what we see on the next tab, now that I have gone through that first part of expert assessment, where the system tells me the criticality of the asset and allows me to choose a corresponding policy, now I'm able to start to see the various problems and countermeasures that could be relevant to this project. So based on my survey answers, SD Elements has gone off to its knowledge base and it has identified a number of problems here. And we see specifically that I have P216 highlighted. You can see on this screen that we do provide a description of the problem. A description of what could go wrong. And furthermore, if I were to click just right here at the far side, we can also see tasks or countermeasures that are related to addressing this problem. So I'm going to pause right here for just a second and get you to think about what you've seen so far. I shared my browser, I selected a profile, I went through and answered some questions in the survey. That's typically about a 15 to 30-minute process, depending on how you've customized the survey and how familiar the user is with it. And now immediately I'm able to understand an approximate level of risk associated with this asset and the potential threats that are associated with it as well. Many organizations that I talk to who are trying to threat model in a more traditional manner, they're able to focus on a very small subset of the overall portfolio, and they're spending considerably more time on getting to the point that we've gotten to here, understanding what the threats are that face the system. Then there's still the whole process of figuring out what you want people to do about it and so on. So SD Elements really accelerates this process. And one thing that I would also note here is that what you could do and what some organizations choose to do is actually based on that classification, you can have tasks or processes, activities within this project that may say, hey, because you're critical, you do need to have that more manual touch, that more formal assessment. But SD Elements allows us to provide a minimum baseline across an entire portfolio, as opposed to focusing on that 10 or 15, 20% of extremely high value assets. Now, of course, the other sort of perspective here, besides taking the threat-based approach or the problem-based approach that I'm showing you here, the other way to look at this is from the perspective of countermeasures. And actually, before I talk about countermeasures, let me just finish up on that idea of rapid threat modeling. As I mentioned, we complete the survey. I can see the problems that are relevant to this project. I may also just want to run a quick report on this. And so my next tab here was just to show you that it is possible with one of our built-in reports to get a nice summary of the problems or weaknesses that may impact an asset. Of course, each one of these has a risk score associated with it, and we can click on a given line item to see what tasks we should do in order to address this problem. So again, as I mentioned, we could take a look at the requirements view as well, or the tasks view. So once we've identified what the problems are, we can now see what are some of the things that we may want our developers to take on. Specifically, I'm going to take a look at this task, T21. So again, I've got another tab to show you that. The tasks in SD Elements do begin with a problem statement that describes what the threat is here or what the weakness is, the thing that could go wrong if we are not careful about what we implement in our code. And you'll see that there is also a solution. So the solution text, as with the problem text, we provide these by default, but the customer with the correct role-based permission has the ability to tailor these according to organizational need. So if you have either a legacy need for TLS 1.1 or you are a pioneer and you want to prepare for TLS 1.4, you have the ability to localize this content as well as supplement it with completely original content so that it's really tailored according to what your developers are expecting and what they need to implement. Along with the solution guidance, I also wanted to touch on the idea of developer enablement and education. So if we scroll down a little farther, we'll see that there are two items that I'm going to speak about here. The first is this training bit. If you're familiar with Security Compass at all, you may know that we have a department that's fully dedicated to developing e-learning courses to help developers write more secure code. In SD Elements, what we do is we take those larger courses and we break them down module by module. And so you could see here that from our OWASP Top 10 course, the clear text communication module is associated with this task T21, which is about encrypting data in transit. So I can actually click on that training course. I'll see the content load up. I am going to have to mute it relatively quickly here when it does load so that it doesn't deafen me. Whoops, there we go. And so as you can see, there's a video that plays here. There's an audio track. There is also a text transcript. And these are made available to developers, not just in the SD Elements interface, but as we'll see in a moment, we can synchronize this content out to issue trackers like Jira, Azure DevOps, and a number of others. So this training content now becomes available to the developer in the issue tracker as they're implementing the task, hence our terminology of just-in-time training. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here very quickly is the concept of a how-to. Lots of times developers want to find examples of what it is they need to implement, code samples. And SD Elements provides you with a way to dynamically provide a code sample in the right language, given the information gathered in the survey. So rather than having to go out and do a Google search and find some untrusted source of information online, a security team now has the ability to embed your own code samples alongside ours. And again, these all are delivered to the developer. If I just move over to my next tab, I've got a Jira window here. And what we'll see is that the task guidance that we saw from SD Elements has been synchronized over. As I scroll down, we will see that the code samples that we just took a look at have also been synchronized over. And finally, right down at the bottom, we're going to see that the training links have been synchronized into this ticket as well. So now as a developer, I kind of have an explicit requirement, which is better than what I see in some organizations that we work with, where security is often implied. So I have a specific requirement. I have customizable details telling me what it is I need to do. I've got a code sample that shows me how I might implement it in the language that I'm writing this product in. And I've got training modules available at my fingertips in case there's any additional information that I need to follow up on. So with all that having been said, now from the developer perspective, the only thing I have to do is mark this work done when it's done. I don't need to go and work in SD Elements. There may be a security champion on my team who's responsible for adjusting the survey in SD Elements, but the typical developer just receives requirements as part of a sprint, marks the work done, and that completion status is then reflected in SD Elements via bidirectional communication. So we've got about 8 minutes left. The last couple of things to touch on here. So far, we have looked at information gathering via the profile in the survey. We've talked a little bit about expert assessment, where we can assess a risk classification based on survey conditions. We can also determine the problems and tasks that are relevant to a project based on those survey conditions. And as you've seen here, those tasks can be customized and tailored according to survey conditions as well. We've made recommendations by synchronizing from SD Elements into Jira, and we've seen how as developers work on the tasks in Jira, the completion statuses will be synchronized back to SD Elements. So now the last section of the demonstration, the last thing we want to talk about here is how can we verify what the developers are doing, and how can we report on this whole process that we're undertaking to actually make some use of the of the information that gets gathered. So moving on to another tab, this is a different project from the one I started the demonstration on, but what you'll see down the left-hand side is that these tasks have all been marked complete, and you could now imagine that that has happened because a developer has marked completion statuses in their issue tracker of choice. You may notice, though, on the right-hand side, we have different colored flags here indicating varying levels of verification. So the two that I'll focus on are the red flag, and right above it, you see that there's no flag. So let's talk about those two for just a second. If I expand this task, T21, what we're going to see here is that I've imported results from 3 different tools. And though I have some conflicting information here, the important thing to take away for today's purposes is that Checkmarks claims to have found something in the code that contradicts the completion status of T21. So if we dig into this, we can actually see that Checkmarks claims to have found 77 counts of clear text submission of information. This may be a false positive, could be a real finding, might be a great opportunity for us to look at the related tasks and follow up on one of those test cases that I talked about earlier. The other thing, of course, is what about this task 1468 that has no verification status at all? I mean, I've imported 3 different scan results, right? But there's no flag set on this task. And so ultimately what we'll see is that if I turn on some filtering here, there's more than one task that's like this, where the developer has attested to the fact that it's been done. We can see with these 3 tasks, they're marked complete. We can also see over here that my risk policy, the policy that I selected earlier to help identify high value prioritized work, this policy, this filter is turned on. So that means that these tasks are part of that policy and therefore must be complete and perhaps also verified in order to confirm that this policy is satisfied. So again, this is another good opportunity. We've identified perhaps some limitations in our automation capabilities. This might be a good opportunity for us to look at the related tasks, see that there are testing tasks available, and then have a resource complete those tasks and provide manual verification status as appropriate. So in the final couple of minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about reporting. I think of reporting as really taking 2 forms. There's sort of a traditional kind of air quotes paper-based reporting, which I'll show you from SD Elements. There is also this idea of CI/CD. And to me, CI/CD is almost like real-time reporting, because if something's out of compliance and your pipeline's configured correctly, you may have it break, or you may have it send some notifications. And those pipelines will actually call SD Elements via the API and use this risk policy as that bar or as that threshold to determine whether something can or cannot be deployed based on whatever the policy says, right? Whichever tasks are identified by the policy, whatever completion status is allowable for that policy, and whatever verification status is allowable. So again, won't go into a bunch of detail on CI/CD. If you're interested, please visit the virtual booth and arrange a more complete demo. What I will wrap up on here very quickly is the idea of built-in reporting. So at the project level, you can see here there are a few different reports that are available. The risk policy report helps highlight those tasks that are covered by the policy. It can act as a nice roadmap to deployment for a lot of projects. I also already touched on the problem summary report. I showed you this right at the conclusion of the survey. Ended up going in and showing you this problem summary report. So the one I'll focus on for now is the compliance report. As you have seen, SD Elements comes with a lot of built-in content, and those regulations are part of that built-in content. You've also got the ability to add your own regulations, whether that is an industry standard or an internal policy that you may have, or in fact, a harmonization of a number of different standards that could all be built into one single policy. So by running a compliance report, what we're able to do is pull those policies apart section by section and actually see which tasks are relevant to each given section. So I went ahead and ran one of these reports a little earlier, and because we had selected back in the survey that this was going to be handling personal data and was going to be subject to the laws of the US, I've gone ahead here and run a California Consumer Privacy Act compliance report. So I'll scroll down to the main part of the report, and what we'll see is what I was just saying about how the sections have been all split out in this policy. We get a description of what the policy says, what it requires, and we can also see tasks in SD Elements that satisfy the spirit of this article, of this section. So we get information about the task itself, the priority, the completion status, who did the work, whether it's been verified, and so on. The final thing that I'll point out here, if I can find a good example of it, which maybe I can't, I'll just highlight this right now. If there are tasks that are relevant to the project but are not relevant to the regulation, the report will actually highlight that. We want to try and avoid any ambiguity, especially if you're talking to an internal or external auditor. We don't want there to be ambiguity in terms of what's been implemented. And so by highlighting what's in scope for this project, as well as what's out of scope based on the survey, that allows us to do away with that ambiguity and have a really good picture of the current compliance stature of the asset under development. So with that, I see that my timer is at the 1 minute point. Thank you for joining today's session. As I said, my understanding is that if you would like a longer demo or would like to schedule something a little more interactive, please visit the virtual booth, ask any questions that you may have there. It's been a pleasure showing you SD Elements today, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much.